Welcome to Talking in Stations. I am Matterall, News Chief for the Mittani.com and Imperium.news. Today we have a special program. It's just an interview between me and Mittani. Mittani is head of the Imperium and has been for many years now. He's also the founder of the Mittani.com and the Imperium.news. So there is a relationship. He is my boss. He is my space boss, that is. But we're putting all that aside and we're just talking like two players from EVE Online. Welcome to the show, Mittani.
Happy to be here.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could tell the audience how we came to meet from your perspective. I've written about it in my perspective, but I always wondered what it was like for you.
Well, I had no idea that we would end up in the longer term having any kind of friendship or relationship. It was a situation where we were at EVE Vegas last year, and I don't remember who I was talking to at the time, but I think I was introduced to you, or you were pointed out to me as being the EVE News 24 guy, at which point I try to remember what it was that had torqued me off. I think that there was some sort of misunderstanding, miscommunication. I remember correcting that, and then we had a conversation that developed over a couple of interactions. I think that we had the chat on the show floor, as it were, at EVE Vegas, right, and then later ran into each other upstairs in the mezzanine at some other point in time. We ended up talking to each other. You discovered that I wasn't a monster. I discovered that you were not one of Riverini's shills, and was sort of off to the races.
Yeah, I think the first time we met, you were actually, you had just kissed, it was in front of Grath as well, but you just kissed the hand of the Space Pope.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Max, and then you turned and said, or somebody said Matterall or something, and you turned and said, you're the only writer who doesn't suck over there. And I just thought that was brilliant because you single-handedly put down who I worked for and complimented me at the same time. And I was like, that guy is a master at dividing people.
Well, I mean,
you're saying,
you could say that I'm a master at dividing people, or you could say that I am simply speaking the truth, and the truth divides people.
Oh, very interesting. And I think the next time we met, I actually thought, I really wanted to talk to you, like I'm going to talk to you in this interview, to get to know kind of the high level of EVE that you play is unlike anybody else's, or very few people. And I always wanted to kind of figure out, like, what's it take to play at that level? And that's what I was trying to approach you at EVE Vegas. But the EN24 label got in front of me because of some of the history you and Riverini had. So yeah, the next time we met was we were walking by each other. Well, actually we met and, you berated me, and it was really funny. I was actually having a great moment. And then I was like, okay, well, that's the end of that. I'm not going to get that kind of insight. So as I was leaving, I was actually leaving Vegas. I was on my way to my car to drive home to Los Angeles. I ran into you by yourself with nobody else on this gigantic mezzanine. And then I said, I cannot not stop and talk to him. And that's when we stopped and talked. And then you invited me up, and then that's when we talked for like an hour and a half, I think.
I think it was possibly even 2 hours. It was quite some time. I mean, it's always interesting when you get a perspective from a different side of the aisle. I mean, you come from, when I met you, from EVE News 24, and of course you are still part of NC Dot. So I think it's fascinating and rare when in EVE people are able to behave like adults and communicate like adults to try to describe what the hell it is that we have all collectively gotten ourselves into with this incredibly wild and also silly game.
Yeah, we're kind of all in it together at the end of the day if you back up far enough. So, but let's start with at EVE Vegas, this is the segue. I was doing a speech on basically the Illuminati and the people who kind of run the game behind the scenes and how deep it goes, and it goes very deep. And so after that speech, during that speech, I had referenced the Guiding Hand Social Club. And do you remember who they are?
Yeah, actually, Istvan and I go way back.
Yeah, and the thing is that you had brought them up before too, because you represent the legacy of that kind of stuff. So can you tell us what what did it mean to the game at the time?
Well, that was one of the things that really made Eve's unique value proposition, as it were, go public through the gaming world. Eve was the only game that allows you to operate without the rule of law, like Somalia in space, which is my usual catchphrase to describe it. So the original PC Gamer article about Istvan Shogatsu and the Guiding Hand Social Club is one of the reasons why I got into Eve originally. It was published in 2005 and was the ubiquitous Seraph, possibly late 2004, the ubiquitous Seraph heist. Um, by modern standards, it wasn't really a big deal. It was a classic corp theft, and they did a fantastic job media-wise of playing it up as something involving, Valentine operatives and all of the classic lingo of and some invented lingo of the spy game. And between that and a couple of other early stories about people stealing stuff from each other and lying to each other in these long-term spying and scams and chaos, is the idea of a metagame in a single shard galaxy is something that you can't get anywhere else. And that's one of the reasons I came into Eve. Was there was a thread on somethingawful.com that had just a sort of a recruitment post saying this is what this game is and these are the places that goons are playing Eve. This was back before Goonfleet. This is when we had a little organization called Lordless, and I think it was the idea of getting involved with a game that actually had espionage and chaos was one of the things that pushed me into actually giving it a whirl.
So, what in your background attracted you to that?
Probably just too much time in DC.
you,
um,
you were a lawyer there, right?
Yeah, I was a white collar criminal defense attorney back when I was practicing in DC. I got involved in Eve in late 2000, mid 2005. Of course, got involved with the early days of Goonswarm in January of 2006. Took a little break there between the creation of Lordless and Goonfleet. I'm not too sure what it is. I was tired of World of Warcraft, which is a pretty standard thing. I made a throwaway character. I was just going to give it a try on a whirl. And on a whim, I should say, and I used the character name for one of my old Vampire the Masquerade characters, which was the Mittani. So
Oh, wow.
little did I know that I would then be known under this moniker. Um, but the thing is that what pushes you over the edge to try a game could be pretty minor. Like, it's like, oh, whatever, we'll kick the tires and see what happens. And I had no idea at the time, even though the Guiding Hand Social Club in that article was an inspiration. I had no idea that I would end up doing any of this stuff.
So, when you got an Eve, what was it like for you at the time? Like, what were the things that you were doing that were so grand?
Well, I wasn't doing anything grand at all. What was interesting to me was we had a little corporation in Losec called Lordless, and this had many of the directors of the early days of Goonfleet in it later. So people like Remedial, people like Sitsno, people like First Name, Last Name, Sefty, a lot of the really old school crew. And we were doing things in Eve that, Eve itself was, of course, boring as hell, right? Like the actual game was pretty dumb, but we sat around on TeamSpeak, and there was a whole bunch of, this was, again, the mid 2000s. So back in that era, most of the people who were in leadership in any kind of somethingawful.com related organization was this nest of libertarians. I am ashamed to admit that when I was younger, I was a libertarian. I got over it when I hit my 30s. But, at the time, it's a bunch of libertarian lawyers in this little corporation in Losec. And again, no rule of law. So it was right after they had introduced player-owned stations. So we had one of the first posses up in a little system called Beaky. And one of the guys in the corp, it might have been Remedial, had this fantastic idea of selling fake bookmark sets. So back in the day before contracts, you had escrow, and before Warp to Zero, everybody had full sets of bookmarks to be able to get anywhere in LowSec or NullSec. And the genius idea about this was it was a set for the Genesis region that our corporation sold everywhere. And so we could make money selling bookmarks, and they were a legitimate set of bookmarks, except for only two bookmarks. And those two were the in and out bookmarks for the system of Beaky. And it just so happened that that particular bookmark would send you directly on top of our tower, which would obliterate you. So it was it was glorious. So instead of really doing anything in Eve Lordless, we would just sort of sit around orbiting this prank apple pos, and it was a gigantic bug zapper. And we would just, me and Fernock Dorn would just be sitting around and watching these idiots just slam into it, blow up. We'd loot their wrecks and troll them in local. And they would have no idea. That's the thing, is because it was a perfectly legitimate bookmark set. So they would insist that it was a bug. They'd petition CCP. They wouldn't, we would offer to help them. We would say, "Oh, hey man, I'll, bring another ship. I'll get your stuff. It's here. I don't know what's going on," because they didn't realize that there was a connection between the bookmark set and the tower that just blew them up. And in many cases, they had no idea what a tower was. So that was what we did in Lordless.
So you guys built a giant mousetrap, basically.
Pretty much.
So where did it go from there, though? When I meant grand, I meant things that were big to you when you were just starting the game, things that seemed grand.
Well, Eve seemed pretty small scale to me until we got to Goonfleet, really. So Lordless, like a lot of entities that are smaller than Dunbar's number, eventually imploded in drama, which is, I think, a standard thing for any lower than 150 human entity or human social group, period, be it in gaming or otherwise. So this happened, and then I took a couple months off. I stopped playing Eve when the corp imploded. And then I didn't really do anything until January of 2006, when I was looking around the forums again, and Remedial, who had been a director in Lordless and a friend of mine, had created Goonfleet, and all the guys from Lordless were there. So I came back to say, like, oh wow, okay, this is my buddies are getting back together. This whole crazy thing looks pretty cool. And immediately Remedial promoted me to being a director, not because I had done anything to deserve it, but merely because he knew me from the Lordless days. I didn't really, I was pleased that I'd gotten the promotion, but I hadn't asked for one, and I had done nothing to earn it. So that is where the actual espionage stuff sort of comes into my Eve career. I started looking for something to do, and I had been inspired by the Guiding Hand Social Club and Istvan Shogatsu. And so I was like, hey guys, like, I'm a director. I don't want to just be Remedial's good old boys club friend. I don't want to just be a sycophant. So why don't I start up an espionage department? And this was back in the dark ages, where you didn't really have espionage groups. You just had individual agents running around doing things on their own. It wasn't a part of alliance warfare. And that's where things started to get more grand. Building the GIA, some of our first operations against NORAD, our first log-off trap, our first female agent, we just started using the level of organization that we had. It was incredibly inspiring what we were able to pull off, and how we were able to use espionage at an organizational level to level the playing field. Because you have to keep in mind that we were almost entirely idiot newbies and rifters. We had one capital ship eventually. We were all floating around Remedial's Thanatos. The joke was because he's fat, and that's why goons orbit Remedial. Right? Fat jokes go a long way back in Goon Swarm, and it started with Remedial, and he was the CEO. So then, there's this natural progression of building the agency. That first log-on trap to nuke a freighter with NORAD that was holding everything a corporation owned, and then next thing you know, we're involved in the Great War, and then it's off to the races. And after that, it was just this escalating process of, in many ways, after the NORAD login trap was probably June, maybe May, June of 2006. The Great War started in July of 2006. So we didn't really have much of an opportunity to sit back and wonder or feel like what we were doing was grand. We did think it was pretty cool at the NORAD level, but when the Great War kicked off, that was a war of extinction. Espionage was pretty much one of the only things that we could do to win, and it became a matter of victory and survival rather than, oh wow, this is so awesome.
Yeah, we talked about that. The fight for survival and the extinction that was, you thought your enemies were coming to make you extinct from the game. And we'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to ask, you got drawn into the Great War for how did that happen? I think you guys made a joke that was not liked by people or something.
I think it was going to happen regardless, based upon everything that we saw on the forums of Band of Brothers later once we got access to all that fun stuff. What happened was Sir Mole had seen a forum signature of Tetsujin, who was a line member of Goonfleet, who was mocking the fact that at any opportunity, our enemies within EVE, who at this point, pre-Great War, attempted to use Remedial, making fun of the death of a player called Smosky, Remedial and first name, last name, in I think early 2005, before the creation of Goonfleet, were being asshole goons. And at any time, the EVE community would point their finger at us and bring up this original sin, as it were, even though it was pre-Goonfleet, and bandwagon against us over it. So Tetsujin Sig was literally an emote of the bandwagon from Something Awful, running over an ASCII image of a corpse. So, of course, this taken outside of context, and who cares anyway, was turned into a bloody shirt. The reality was that we were taking space in Cloud Ring at the time. We had been involved in a campaign against D2. This was Dusk and Dawn. And at the very moment when we were having a final battle, and this is an era when dreadnoughts mattered, we had actually been blowing up tons of D2 dreads, fighting Razor, fighting D2 in the system of XZH, which is the most valuable system in Cloud Ring then as now. And right at this pivotal battle, we had reached out to Ascendant Frontier to send us a battleship fleet, and they had sworn that they were going to do this. Now, Bob's next target was Askin, and also, instead of being cute newbies who were doing whatever, suddenly, even though this original sin and this signature had been around forever, suddenly it was time to vilify goons and try to rally the entire community to exterminate the cancer on Eve and all this other hypocritical, self-righteous bullshit that proceeded to flow from our dear friend, Sir Molly.
I can sense you getting angry about it.
I never stop getting angry about it, actually. That's the thing about the Great War, and it's a thing that people in later eras of EVE don't understand, is that it was a different time. The early Goonfleet was unique compared to many entities that I have spied on over the years, and that even before the Great War, we met up in person almost immediately. So I played World of Warcraft and many other online games and not had a sort of a, hey, we should all get together. But EVE, because everyone has a shared experience, and I think the consequence of EVE inspires people to bond more. And that was particularly the case when you're dealing with a goon community. So we were already a community from Something Awful, and then you take that community, you put them in the trenches together in EVE. So these were my friends. These are my friends. And so having these outsiders hypocritically condemning us and trying to tear our group apart evokes a kind of atavistic primal rage. And you saw that hate fuel the Great War on both sides for the next 3 years. And then you can count the bonus round with IT Alliance for another year for all of the burning and salting of the earth.
Well, that's really interesting, because what you're saying is that it was the combination of you guys being Goonswarm and belonging to a community society through Something Awful, the forum that you belong to. In addition to that was the trials that EVE, the terrible trials that EVE puts you through, that made the cement that kind of glued you guys together.
I agree. I mean, it's sort of, you would say it's a chicken or the egg thing, but there's a lot of, there's goon guilds everywhere. Every single online game has usually the dominant entity in any online game is either from Something Awful or is affiliated with Something Awful people or has them in leadership. So goons are everywhere, whether you like it or not. But it was very strange that very rapidly, even before the Great War, we were getting together and hanging out. And that's my theory, is that it's the dual layer. There are corporations within EVE that do not get together, do not hang out with each other at that same level. And so even before the Great War, that's what I think it is a community plus external community plus the additional trials of Eve resulted in uh, the creation of a real world tribe.
I wonder if that's, not all corporations do that, but Sir Mole and Evolution, his corporation, has a barbecue every year. They still do that, so it's very bonding there. Dice Corporation is meeting in E Vegas for their 10-year anniversary, and it just seems like the maybe it is the nature of the game and how difficult it is that brings people to have bonds that are usually stronger than in other games.
I think so. I mean, I think that Eve has consequences that everybody can relate to. Everybody has a story about getting blown up, losing something of consequence. Everybody has a story about fighting for their buddies in the trenches, playing when they don't necessarily want to for a greater cause. Eve unites people in nullsec, at least, to a lesser degree in lowsec, but I've seen this at FanFest and other places. It is primarily a nullsec phenomenon. The consequences unite people and forge these bonds in a crucible.
Yeah, you're waking up in the middle of the night to take down a tower.
Exactly.
All right, so, but now let's talk about leadership because at some point you did step up. You started the spy agency for your corporation and alliance, and so that was in some ways something that was right up your sleeve coming from the background that you did in Washington, D.C. But at what point did that transition into real leadership where you had to take responsibility for running an overall alliance or coalition at that point, probably?
July of 2006. So
Wow. So you've been at it a while, 10 years.
yeah, well, I mean, the function of the Great War and the situation between the lordless directors that ended up in charge of and creating Goonfleet was we all knew each other before then. Remedial, I was Remedial's number two guy, and when Band of Brothers invaded Syndicate, Remedial had to go or otherwise sort of left me to elucidate our strategy because either he vanished or he had real life stuff or whatever the reason was. I was left to give a briefing instead of a State of the Union to tell everybody our strategy, which was the VCB strategy. The VCB strategy was everybody was going to. I had spent enough time at this point emergency studying Band of Brothers and realized that the best way to get them to fuck off was to turn their obsession with their kill boards against them. So we had everybody in Goonfleet create a million zero SP like alpha clone alt accounts using the same template called them VCBs like the Viet Cong, whereupon we would use newbie ships to literally clog their kill board with thousands and thousands of pointless kills and pods, all the while screaming at them and mocking them in local, in sort of a goon pigeon of give missile or bump.
Is that
Now,
where the term "we'll clog their cannons with our bodies" came from?
yeah, well, no, that had happened before then, because even then we were taking down hacks with Rifter swarms. Uh, but the VCB strategy was controversial at the time because I had, for the first time, I wasn't a leader at this point. I was giving a speech and basically saying, "All right, guys, we're going to do something that nobody has done in Eve before, and please take it on faith that I don't have my head up my ass because Remedial is off eating a turkey somewhere or whatever." So I ate shit basically for 2.5 weeks because this didn't make sense. How do you win a war by suiciding pointlessly into an enemy's guns? But they had brought all their fancy T2 BPO based toys, and the only thing that we could really see was that their pride was so obsessed with their kill boards that once we rendered their kill boards meaningless, they would leave. So sure enough, 2.5 weeks later, DB Preacher declared victory loudly, and then they fucked off, saying that goons would never be allowed to build up in 0-0 again. Um, and after that, I had been, after that, I think people had a bit of more respect. I didn't know I could pull it off. I didn't know that the strategy would work. It was just our best shot. And after that, that built up some cred, and the spy agency went more places, and we had a terrible purpose. So that was basically after that. I was always the number two guy, sort of shadow behind the throne type, for a number of administrations up until May of 2010 when I took over and became the actual CEO.
One of the people that was leading Goonswarm at the time was Darius Johnson, known as DJ, and he proceeded over the invasion of Fountain, I believe, and Delve. And so after all that happened, Goonswarm kind of took over Bob's territory in the south because Bob had been imploded through Spy. I think that story is well known, so we won't cover that. But
Hmm.
after you guys kind of self-destructed by not paying your Sov bill, I guess Cartoon went on vacation, you guys retreated into Syndicate. What were those years like?
Well, they weren't really years. It was just a period of a couple of months.
Right.
So what happened was this is the
Years and
Great
Eve, I
Whelp of
guess.
Delve. Right. The Great Whelp of Delve was February of 2010, and our finance minister had just stopped playing the game. We had only had one finance guy, one CFO, which is a org failure that we don't have anymore. That's why we have a finance team in modern Goonswarm. Um, didn't pay the Sov bills. They all hit at once, and I was the person left in charge, so I had to give the evac order to get everybody's stuff out and try to mitigate the damage when Cartoon inevitably went fuck goons because he couldn't handle people saying that he fucked up. Um, and I called Darius Johnson up because I had at this point been pretty convinced that I did not have what it takes to lead the alliance. I had always been a behind the scenes guy and I didn't want to be CEO. So Darius Johnson had been retired for a long while at this point, and it was an emergency though. So I called him up and said, "Hey man, can you come lead us through this valley?" Um, Syndicate kind of sucked. We were there for only a couple of months. Then we went to Curse in XX9. Syndicate was not what we had hoped it was. I mean, it was one of those things you can never go back. The nostalgic feelings of what Syndicate was in 2006 simply weren't there. There were super caps everywhere, and it was just sort of a crap system. DJ ended up having a big fight with Freeze, who is this FC, created the Elitistop Schism, which is a little corp that's still in PL today, full of people who are mad at DJ, amusingly enough. Uh, and then he left to go work for CCP, and I was the last man standing. Basically, nobody wanted to be the CEO, and when I stepped up to do it reluctantly, we barely had 30 people on a fleet, and we were in Curse, and we had nothing. So there you go.
So what was rebuilding like?
Oh, well, it's a lot of work. The first thing that I had to do was find some activity and some purpose and security for our guys. So we had moved around too much. So one of the rules is you never want to change your stager more than once every 3 months because otherwise people get org shock. So I told everybody that we're going to stay put here. Then I released all of our political prisoners. I basically unbanned everybody that DJ had rage banned over the years, and in classic Maoist fashion, allowed 1,000 flowers to bloom. And basically just started over from there and implemented a team structure in the directorate such that there would be no more CFO vanishes, we're screwed. And then after a couple of months, things had stabilized, and TCF was kind enough to offer us a couch in Declan. So we moved from Curse to Declan and sort of settled in. And by that point, we'd changed our alliance name from Solo Drachman, Solo Drachman, Solo Drach Lordra, as it were, the old alliance, into Goonswarm Federation. And after that point, it was off to the races.
That was one of the most interesting moments in Eve for me, was that Tau Ceti Federation had kind of given you a home after you were seemingly kind of kicked around or beat up around Syndicate, and it just morale was obviously down. You guys were a lot smaller than you were before, and here comes this old ally that writes and declares in public that of course we're going to let this old friend, live with us. And so they move you in. And later on, Tau Ceti kind of became a part of Goonswarm or something like that, right? What was that like?
Well, I think that's called letting somebody crash on your couch, essentially. And that happens an awful lot in Eve. In terms of the number of people who are leaders in Eve and the entities that have been sticking around for a while, it's more common than you think. Because if a tribe stays together after a failure cascade, or if it doesn't even have a failure cascade, because we didn't, we just had a lack of active players, eventually that tribe will rebuild if there is strong leadership and a purpose. So it's only good sense to do that diplomatically. that's a general Eve comment. Tau Ceti and Goonswarm had been core members of what was called the Red Storm Federation, or coalition with Red Alliance, Tau Ceti, and Goonswarm, and fought through and helped win the Great War. So our bonds with TCF go back to the foundation of Goonswarm. I mean, when the rest of the galaxy was busy singing Sir Moli's tune and self-righteously pointing their fingers at us, the only people who would actually even talk to Goonswarm diplomatically were Red Alliance and TCF. Everyone else turned their backs on us, including, of course, dear old Sivok. Whenever I encounter a former Ask in person, I say, "Where's my fucking battleship fleet that we promised on that day?" So, the bonds of the Great War were much stronger than the kind of bonds that I think you see in modern Eve. And so TCF was delighted to give us a couch, and then later a whole number of the people from TCF ended up merging the corporations into Goonswarm Federation, and we still have them today.
So from that point, you built up not just one alliance, but you built up, sister alliances, or you formed basically the Clusterfuck Coalition, which was the CFC for a long time, and you built that up into a credible power. What was that all about? Was that a part of a strategy?
Oh, it was an accident. I mean, that's why I called it the clusterfuck. I mean, that's not a reflection of a long-term plan there. What happened was Vuk Lao, who was the leader of the Northern Coalition, Goonswarm was in an unusual position. We were living in Declan, which was in Northern Coalition territory, but we were not formally a member of the Northern Coalition because I did not want us to be in that. And a lot of people in the NC probably didn't want us there either. As we grew more and more power, it was, I would say, destabilizing for the NC because Goonswarm is an autocracy. Even before I took over, Goonswarm has always been an autocracy. That's one of our strengths. And the NC was just poisoned internally by endless bickering and council bullshit. So Vuk Lao launches an attack on the drone regions, provokes a whole bunch of Russians for no reasons and no strategic ends, and then is not there to provide any leadership or defense when the counterattack comes. So the Northern Coalition falls. White Noise takes over Branch just to the north of Declan, and then you saw basically everyone on the Russian side deciding that it was probably a bad idea to involve Goonswarm in the war. And we were left with whoever was still surviving on the NC side after the Russians settled in or vanished. And we were the last man standing with the most power. So people looked to us for safety. And that's how we ended up being accidental coalition leaders. And so I looked at this, these are some allies that, Goonswarm would normally have nothing to do with, culturally speaking. There is massive cultural conflicts with FCON, which is no surprise considering recent history. But, you make do with what you have, and we ended up making a coalition out of it. And that's why I named it to start with. Well, this is a clusterfuck. And it was off to the races.
So basically, it was kind of a huddling of refugees from the
Absolutely.
Russian attack.
The CFC was a refugee camp to begin with, no doubt.
That's funny. Now, you mentioned earlier 1,000 flowers to bloom or something like that. So you have a way of writing that, or even expressing yourself, that is, I don't think it's paralleled by anybody else. There are some good writers out there, but I always enjoyed your Sins of the Solar Spymaster series that you wrote for 10 Ton Hammer. That was not my introduction to you necessarily because I knew about you in game, but that's the first time I actually saw you as something other than the enemy. Because I was usually in on the opposite side of you. I was in Dead Terrorists at one point when you were in Syndicate. We were fighting you guys there. Mm-hmm. Everybody decided that you guys were a target because it was fun to mess with you guys because you guys were. You guys would fight, but also you guys were kind of known as semi-toxic, so people felt righteous about it. So there's this righteous feeling about fighting you guys out there. But when you were a writer, I thought, this guy's an amazing writer. I read everything that you wrote. So how did that column start?
Well, the column started because of a friend of mine, Cody Bai, who was my editor at Tinton Hammer, reached out to me when we disbanded Band of Brothers, and he interviewed me. And so he sent me a list of questions, and I wrote answers to them. And his response upon reading it was something to the effect of, "You're a pretty good writer. Would you like to write a column about Eve and get paid?" And I was like, sure. So this was after February 4th, 2009, obviously, which is when the disband happened. And I started cranking out columns 3 or 4 a month. And then after I took over leadership of Goonswarm, then I had less time to write. So you sort of saw after around like the 80th column, it was beginning to kind of peter out just because the amount of obligations that I had was increasing massively across the board. But it was an accidental thing that I started out uh, becoming a part of the gaming media, which is hilariously ironic on a lot of levels, basically.
Because you were persecuted by it, I think you said something like that.
Later, that came
Mm.
later. That was our dear old friend Riverini and his little antics with Brendan drained of massively, and I'm sure that they are all finding success in their endeavors.
Well, we'll put them aside for now. But back to Sins of the Solar Spy Master. I guess that's a take on what?
Sins of a Solar Empire, which was a popular game at the time. We're like, what the hell are we going to call this thing? So Sins of a Solar Spy Master was a throwaway. Again, kind of like with the Mittani thing. I had no idea that that column would take off, or that people would like it, or that I'd end up cranking out 80 plus of them, or later on having our own media website. So sort of a silly throwaway name that then becomes a thing.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So it was just something that you were going to write about, something you knew. You knew about spy mastering and Eve, which is a very complex and mysterious game. So there was definitely an audience for that kind of intrigue. How did it go while you were actually writing it? Did you have a sense that it was a column that people were reading?
Yeah. I mean, I would write them, and people would comment on them, and all the guys liked them. Actually, that became a source of guilt after a point, which is I think a common problem. Everybody who's a writer, the muse is a fickle mistress, right? Sometimes you'll feel inspired to write something, but writing on a schedule is a nightmare unless you dedicate yourself in a disciplined way to become a writer in a formal sense, and you have what everybody always says is you have to have a daily writing habit where you get up in the morning and you bash out your first 500 words no matter what. I was not that guy. I was writing when I was working at my firm, and um, as the column became more popular and fans would mail me in game and otherwise and say, "Hey, when's the next column?" Stuff like that. That added, I think, to a level of stress to produce. Um, but yeah, no, I knew it was popular right from the start because the editors loved it and wanted more, and started making a. I'm not sure whether the column made a name for me or whether the Band of Brothers disband had created a spotlight for the column, but it was popular immediately.
Yeah. And so did that well, actually, I want to talk about your style and how you write. I mean, where do you find these descriptions? How do you come up with this stuff?
Well, I mean, I can't take credit for pretty much anything that I write. I mean, you're always standing on the shoulders of giants. The "let a thousand flowers bloom" thing is just a corrupted version of "let a thousand flowers blossom" or something that comes from Mao, actually, and not in a pretty way. That refers to a purge that he did to solidify power in the Communist Party. I'm a book nerd. I've always read a lot of different things. I've studied a lot of history over the years. And I think just after a while, I've picked up a lot of references to stuff, and that just comes out in the writing. It's very flattering when people compliment the writing, but I don't really think of myself as, some amazing writer. I'm just sort of doing my thing, and people like it.
You probably feel like you're channeling something, right?
Yeah, I think that's normal for most writers. It's like intuition is a funny thing, and I've said this and said it in a number of interviews actually about the Bob disband, but I think it applies to writing as well. Is that one's intuition is an unconscious process, and so when you have a eureka moment, it feels like a bolt from the blue. So when the muse strikes, or a really amazing turn of phrase, or a world-shattering idea drops into your lap, it did in theory come out of your brain, and in theory you have the credit for I came up with this idea, but in practice it feels like just a portal open to another reality, and something really brilliant came out and fell in your lap, and you're like, oh well, I guess I'll do this then. So it can be hard to really um, look at this and go, wow, that's brilliant, I did that. It's something got vomited out of my unconscious, and there it was.
Yeah, I think most artists, and I come from that background as well, you feel like you're channeling something because you don't feel like you deserve ownership for it. But it did come from you, and that filter that is you, everything that you've read as it comes through you is a credit to you. And so when you don't want to take credit for your writing style, I understand that. But it is a good writing style. I think the last thing I read that just I was floored by it was saying, like the Russians are coming like they're boiling out of the trenches or something. It's just I couldn't believe that line. I was like, who writes like that's amazing. But
It's actually it's sort of a bitter coda to the whole Alex as a writer thing. So, my father has written a number of pieces for the New York Times and Forbes and a bunch of places, but I was raised reading the New Yorker and always hearing about how the apex of American writing in many ways is the New Yorker magazine, and that's you've made it when you get to the New Yorker. And unfortunately, after the Benghazi thing happened in 2012, one of the most established long-serving editors at the New Yorker linked my obituary and of Valrat and said that I had written the obituary of the year,
wow.
and that was probably the most it just took any kind of air out of my sails, I guess, when it comes to uh, validation when it comes to writing, because it did nothing. I mean, it was actually kind of a bitter thing to be a writer, and once you achieve that, but you achieve it in that way, and I wasn't trying. Um, it was it was very bittersweet, right? I've got the sort of formal nod of congratulations. In theory, you should be doing victory laps, but the circumstances of that are just so shitty that it was kind of like, well, I'm gonna go do something else, I
Yeah,
guess.
you can't really enjoy it because the occasion that brought you to it is
Exactly,
terrible.
exactly.
And that was a terrible time for you, right? When your friend died.
Yep.
I don't know if you know this, but you tweeted out, and I don't want to take you back there, except just this little bit, because it was one of the times that we had crossed paths long ago, and you tweeted out like, "Oh, my diplomat just said shots fired" or something. That's the trouble. I'm saying this totally wrong, but that's what we get for having somebody in Benghazi, or being a diplomat. And then a few hours later, it was confirmed that he was injured fatally. But when you wrote that, I actually wrote back like, "Oh, I hope he's safe," even though in the game we're enemies or whatever. But I just thought like, there's a real human moment.
Yeah,
You know?
that was a brutal time. I mean, one of the weird things about Eve, and this goes beyond um, Benghazi, but the function of Eve alliances past a certain scale, and it's not unique to anyone in the Imperium at all. Um, Eve alliances past a certain scale, in many ways, you find out the news before the real media finds out the news. So Benghazi, we knew what was going on in Benghazi before it had hit any of the wires. When there was the coup attempt in Turkey just a few months back, we knew about that because we had people in Istanbul and in Ankara reporting about the flyovers of the F-16s. So it's this weird parallel universe where you play spaceship games and you find out about things that happen in the world, terrorist attacks, coups, um, before anybody else does.
Yeah. Do you think that it is an international game? There are people from all over the world and from different cultures, and it is a very brainy game. So people who are really sharp want to play this game and compete because it's a very competitive game. So do you think that it's used as kind of a simulator for, say, intelligence agencies?
Unquestionably. I mean, this game is full of military guys, IT guys, military IT guys, and spooks. It's just absolutely lousy with the IC. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's awesome, but it's the only game people who really love their work. It's called a busman's holiday, right? You want to go uh, do what you do if you love your job, even when you're not working. And so Eve has always attracted a massive presence of military veterans, members of the IC, spec ops types, as well as your more standard issue IT people.
Yeah, you can tell by just the way some of the fleets are organized and the language that's used.
Oh yeah, no, and you can also see at public events. You can usually just see the Eve players. There's the IT guys, and there's just a lot of very fit, very aware young men with bags under their eyes from the PTSD.
Yeah. Now, as you became a leader for thousands of people because they look up to you in this game, What's that like for those of us that'll never achieve that?
Well, I wrote a column about part of it is I think one of the old columns that I wrote, and this is probably in 2011 or so, was that Eve makes you bitter. I mean, it really is staring into the abyss, and eventually the abyss stares back. And if you stare at it long enough, then you make the abyss run screaming away from you. So you just sort of go out through the other side of it. The thing about human nature that is revealed in Eve is who humans are when they're in an environment stripped from all consequences and rule of law. So when I refer to Eve as being Somalia in space, or when I say that it's a very tribal thing, these are aspects of human nature that are covered up by civilization and the rule of law that keeps people from murdering people on the street, from scamming people, from doing all these things. I have, not just because of leadership, but because of running the spy agency for so long before I ended up officially being in charge, you see a lot of horrible shit that people do that we try to blind ourselves to in normal society. When there is a charity drive for anybody who is deceased in a terrorist attack, which unfortunately happens a couple times a year, uh, we have to vet it because there have been several occasions where somebody pops up a GoFundMe or something, and they're trying to leverage a tragedy for a scam, right? So there are endless examples of this, and we don't really talk about them or make a big deal about them because it's just humans being humans. But one of the challenges of Eve and leading in Eve is that you have to deal with humans as they are. You can't deal with humans as your high school social studies class tells you people are. Um, in my own experience, I was briefly made CEO of Goonswarm in 2007 before I knew anything about leadership or more about human nature. And I still believed my social studies crap about, uh, you know, just speaking to your opposition and allowing everyone to dissent and all this other sort of stuff. And so the first thing I did when Remedial dropped this hot potato in my lap was go to the most vocal rebels within Goonswarm who are constantly trying to bring the entire thing down around them because of fuck you dad reasons or what have you. And I was going to go have a dialogue with them. I was going to have this discourse, right? And because my high school social studies class suggested that that's what leaders should do, and that's what good, transparent, democratic government should do, and give people polls, and talk to your opposition. Of course, what actually happens is that this validates your opposition, shows you to be a weak leader. You can't keep people safe, gives all the power to the very people that you're having this discourse with. So when I took over properly, and when I suppose, wanted it in May of 2010, the very first thing I did after letting 1,000 flowers bloom was we created a gulag, which was a special section on the forums where only people in the gulag could post there. And we just rounded those people up and threw them in there, never to be heard of again. So, and that worked, right? That's the thing is that there are two views. Well, there's multiple views, but the idea of how people work in terms of macro scale social orders is so utterly at odds with what people in the first world and Western democracies are taught, that it's unreal. It's night and day. Eve is a society that has no rule of law, so you learn more about leadership and how people work by reading about warlords and ancient history. You have to go to the past to figure out how to set up coalition structures. Like Cyrus the Great was a good inspiration on how you set up satrapies and allowing entities to work under one imperial banner while retaining their culture and blah, blah, blah. The rabbit hole goes, I think, far deeper than most think, and it goes to a pretty nasty place sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine. So that's kind of the education you had to look for because it's such a dystopic or dystopian landscape. Is you had to go back to when in lawless human history.
Exactly. No, that happened later, right? It wasn't like we're sitting around going like, "Oh, well, we need to fight this fleet battle, so I'm going to go read the Cyropedia," right? Like
Right.
that's not how that happened. It's just that you know, another example. Again, I don't get credit for this line either. Is a lot of times people will look at a leader and basically say that guy is riding a lion, right? There's a dude on the back of a lion. Holy crap, he's riding a lion. How amazing is he? He's doing this thing. And if you're the guy on the back of the lion, you're going, what the fuck am I doing on a lion? And how the hell did I get up here? And how can I get off this thing or like lead it in place where it either doesn't eat me or eat my friends or holy fuck, I'm riding a lion. What the hell? So, eventually you see patterns in plans, right? You can see, leadership is always two steps forward, one step back, right? It's you have a goal that you're trying to get to, but it's an iterative process with a tremendous number of mistakes. So, later, once we had an idea that our models from school and college were crap and useless in Eve at the higher level, that's when we started, digging through history in order to try to explain an entity as large as the Imperium. I mean, congratulations, you have more than 55,000 unique human beings who are looking to you to guard their fun. And fun and entertainment matters a lot in people's lives. I mean, in many ways, it's how we escape from shitty places in the real world, is
It's
we escape
also
into them.
it's also an investment, unlike other games where you get to keep your stuff. Like this is an investment, and you can be responsible for the loss of your friend's stuff.
Exactly. And I mean, you see that that's one of the things that's unusual is I've seen over the years probably hundreds, and I don't even think that's an exaggeration, of alliance leaders break. The phrase we use is heavy as the head that wears the crown, is the responsibility of it is crushing. The ones that keep with it either enjoy leadership, it's a good fit with their personality, or they are blame flingers, right? They're narcissists to the point that something is always everybody else's fault. I'm not going to say that Pro God Legend is actually a narcissist. I'm not going to say that he's like Donald Trump or something like that. But you'll see that certain people will, when confronted with a responsibility, they failed in some way. We all make mistakes, and their friends suffered. Instead of going, "Wow, sorry guys, this sucks," they cope with it by pointing fingers at everybody else. But those people rarely end up in charge of large or successful organizations because it's just obvious, and people are smart in a certain level. People can be awful, but people collectively in many ways can be very smart and will suss out your bullshit pretty quickly.
I've always wondered this. We're getting near the end of the interview, but I've always wondered. Um, I just didn't want to ask it because it's not appropriate, but I'm going to do it anyway. The Eve. Do you think there's a lot of libertarians that play Eve?
Not anymore.
Mm-hmm. Because I used to run into them all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating because Goonswarm used to be an incredibly libertarian organization. The gimmick was, and originally speaking, Goonswarm, we even set up a free trade zone for God's sakes. This was all Remedial's ideological libertarianism. The entirety of the Goonswarm directorate back in the day pretty much were, we now call them lolberts. I think that EVE Online is far from some sort of, ideological capitalist paradise. I think that the human behavior with EVE Online is one of the biggest reasons why I am not a libertarian anymore. I think that it
Really? So
proves.
Eve convinced you not to be libertarian anymore?
I think that there was a number of reasons
Mm.
why there was that. I was also where I was working at the time in DC, a lot of experience with, I mean, this was during the time of the collapse of structured finance. So I was involved on a number of cases that related to the mortgage-backed securities crisis, and I was watching Adam Curtis documentaries, which is fantastic. He just came out with a new documentary called Hypernormalization or Hypernormality that I'm looking to watch sometime in the next couple of days. But anyway, yeah, no, I mean, I thought that you just got to see Remedial try to implement all of these libertarian paradise ideas that could never normally be implemented in the real world. And we did implement them in Eve, and they were uniformly a disaster. The reality is people want it appears, because Eve in a way is the ultimate democracy. Like, we don't do democracy in any of our organizations because people have already voted. People choose, and you can cross borders in Eve. Nobody can keep you in an alliance. People choose to be in Goonswarm, and what they've overwhelmingly chosen is increasingly a system that is essentially like a militarized socialist autocracy. They want reimbursement. They want the state to take care of them. They want order, and they want somebody who is not going to truck with the people trying to destroy them as a leader. So reimbursement systems, having reference content in the form of good wikis, mentoring programs, and things like that. Oddly enough, Remedial wanted us to be this super capitalist entity, and we ended up being, over time, evolving into sort of a European style socialist state, except covered in blood and gore and guns and constantly on the warpath.
So that's the secret to why I came to work at TMC, because I think when I said, look, I hate to say it, but I can't work for you because I don't like Goon Swarm. I never have, because of toxicity and stuff like that, and I just can't deal with that. But we have to meet at a higher level. So you and I have to figure out what we have in common that can supersede the game. And I basically said, I'm a liberal and I believe in kind of left-wing causes and stuff like that. Not to say that you had to be liberal, but you said, okay, we can meet on some of those issues. So when you
Well, I am pretty far on the left functionally. I'm skeptical of ideology because I used to be an
right,
ideologue, and I've seen that people's views advance and change. But I started out being an ideological capitalist, and now I'm so far on the left, I'm not sure whether I'm on the right or not. I mean, for God's
right,
sakes, like, what
me
am I?
either.
Like, am I a Stalinist? Who knows?
Yeah, it's a big circle. It's not flat left and right.
Exactly.
But yeah, so just a couple more questions. I know you have to go for an interview with Polygon, which is great, and that kind
Mhm.
of sets up this question: is what's it like to be an ambassador of the game? Because on one hand, you're very political of, say, half the game, or a big portion of it. On the other hand, you kind of have to represent the game for people outside of it. Do you have to think about those things?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't really think of representing. I don't consider myself an ambassador for Eve as a whole. I consider myself the leader of my people, and I think that's reflected. Reflected in the public statements that we make. Like, we have always advocated for our guys. We want a strong Eve. A strong Eve is good for Goonswarm, right? And for the Imperium as a whole. So I don't think that there's really that level of a dichotomy. Conflict is fascinating, and the very toxicity that uh, you and many other people don't like about Goonswarm are things that draws people to the game. People who reflect our values join the Imperium, or draws people to the game to shoot us, right? So if you read in Polygon or some other place me saying something like, our enemies who are doing these casinos are a bunch of RMTing hypocritical shills, you read that and either you go, wow, that guy's really, speaking truth to power, let's go fight on his side, or you go, wow, this guy's a pretentious gas bag, I can't stand him. Either way, you're provoking a reaction that's related to EVE Online, and we've found that that far more than any kind of sort of limp-wristed uh, milk toast attitude about the game uh, brings more people into it. Because I mean, Eve, when it comes down to it, Eve is a war game. People can claim that it's many other sorts of games, but it is fundamentally a game about war, whether people like it or not, which could be, sort of scaled up to a broader commentary about human behavior in the real world.
Yeah.
but
Well,
no, so,
I think
there
of
you
it in
go.
terms. Sorry, I think of it in terms of kids running around in the dark. It's like it's fun to chase and to hunt, but it's almost as fun to run and scream and try to get away.
That's true. Well, I mean, I'd prefer to be on the hunt. Running and screaming and getting away is a bit crap, but some people like it, I guess.
No, I think it draws the same reaction from kids. They delight in it, and it's probably has to do with the reward system for getting away is the same endorphins that you get for actually tackling someone. I don't know.
That's true. That's true. It is a big high. There's no doubt about that.
All right. Now, the last set of questions, before we get to them, if I could ask about DJ made a comeback recently, and this is recent politics, and there was kind of this hope that he would, reclaim the mantle of Goon Swarm, and that fizzled out. It turns out. Like, what did you actually think of that? Because you two were good friends.
I don't really want to talk about it. I mean, the reality is that he was put up to it by a bunch of people from Pandemic Legion. It was a PL fronted maneuver. Your statement that there was this hope that he would reclaim the mantle from Goons was purely from the external side of things. It was all of our enemies during the Casino War, uh, before they were exposed to being on the take for
So
Dirty Isk, et cetera, et cetera.
inside it was never an issue. Inside Goon
No, I
Swarm.
mean, look at the numbers. That's the thing. We didn't have anybody. I think we lost like 4 people from within Goonswarm, 3 of which were actually not goons. One of the, and everybody who left to go over there has actually come back. Most of the people that he hoovered up were people who had been thrown out of Goonswarm already, like members of Bat Country, Indy and his clique, Kismeteer, Java Junkie. It was just people who had been thrown out of an airlock for going fuck goons. So that fizzled, and he recently, I don't think he ever got more than 130 characters in his alliance, which probably was about 20 actual humans. The couple people who left to go over there have already come back to Goonswarm and been welcome back because they didn't go fuck goons. They just thought that the grass was greener. It turns out it wasn't. And DJ shut down his thing and loudly went off to join PL, coming as a massive surprise to no one. And I think we're all looking forward to watching his talk at Vegas about how he's a practical guide to building an alliance or something like that.
Right. You'll be there too, which will be interesting. No, I just thought there was a lot of public statements coming from him and from people around him, but you really didn't comment on it while it was going on. So I was wondering if you
There's really,
inside.
I other than saying that it didn't go anywhere and that that is important to comment on. That to say that it was purely something that our enemies tried. They used him as a patsy. It's unfortunate. As far as anything between him and me, there's really nothing to be said about it. He did say an awful lot of things, and it's a good question on your part because you're right. I've been pretty much completely silent about it, and that's for good reason. There's just nothing to say.
Right. So we'll just keep it silent then. The last question is, of course, about the Mittani.com, which is a website that you built in order to, maybe it was an extension of your writing, I don't know. But how did that actually develop and why did it develop?
The Mittani.com existed because we realized that games journalists were our enemies, straight up. The Mittani.com was formed in 2012 because after Riverini and worked with Brendan Drain of Massively.com to attempt to destroy my life essentially by publicizing all of that fun wizard hat stuff. We realized that we needed to have a presence in the gaming media to keep these people honest, which was a lot of fun. I remember at one point the main editor of Massively.com wrote an unironic piece before it shut down about how Goonswarm was, and I quote, cyberbullying, unquote, his website. Apparently, you can cyberbully a website. So we just realized that there were so many people who were hostile to Goonswarm and to any of our endeavors that we needed to have our own media outlet to fight back. Because otherwise, the Brendan Drains of the world would say whatever they felt like about us with no recourse. So this was before Gamergate. So when I say was created as a counterpoint to games journalism being crap. The reality is that many articles, and you saw this over at Evenings 24, many articles in the gaming media that are about Eve, regardless of any agenda they may or may not have regarding Goonswarm, many of those articles are crap because the authors don't know anything about Eve. Now, in the modern era, that's gotten better. You've got a fair number of game journalists who have reported on Eve enough that they've educated themselves. But that's why we started TMC.
Yeah, I have to say, one of the things that I've noticed over the last years is how many people try to sharpen their blade against you by going after you. And I mean by authors and people out in the media. And so it seems to be like attacking you raises their name by becoming an answer to you. And there seems to be like a market for that. So that's what they try to do. But I resent that because then when I, as someone who doesn't have an axe to grind, wanted to talk to you, there was instantly a defense of, I know what you're about and I'm not talking to you. So they kind of blew it for me and other people like me. Do you get that a lot? Do you get a sense that people are trying to position themselves like as your opposite?
All the time. I mean, it's a fairly normal standard. I mean, it's a fairly normal tactic, right? That's how Lyndon Johnson raised his profile against Nixon. Was he managed to bait Nixon into going after him and talking crap about him, actually. And so that's how he instantly got validation. So if I respond to some random person on Twitter, and this happens on an almost daily basis, where someone is trying to get a reaction out of me, if I reply to them, suddenly I am putting a spotlight on them, right?
Yeah, so is this why you guys don't actually? Because when I got here, I was like, well, there's a lot of stuff being said about you guys. Why don't, if it's not true, why don't you counterattack or say what is true? And you guys were like, nah, we'll just forget it.
Well, that's part of it, but also we just don't give a shit.
Yeah, so the other part is not plugging into that.
Well, I mean, that they're not our people, right? Coming out of the outside of a war of extinction, you care about your tribe, especially again staring into the abyss. You understand that for every hypocrite in our most recent dealings with our enemies who are saying that they're doing this or that for the good of the community, and oh, why isn't the Imperium fighting the way that we want? You should provide us content on a platter for the good of the community. The good of the community coming from the mouth of an enemy is bullshit. Maybe they're lying to themselves. If they're more mature, they're at least aware that it's a lie. An enemy is an enemy. Some people, and there's a distinction here between you can wear a NC dot corp ticker, but you are not actively trying to come at us. When somebody who is actually trying to come at us in an aggressive way is doing it under the auspices of some excuse, some bloody shirt, or some sort of, oh, we're just having a charity for children, which is why we're building super capitals in the drone regions. It's horseshit. And we don't buy into it as an organization, which is why when our enemies say mean things about us or say that we should do X or we should do Y, we don't engage in a line by line because nothing they say matters fundamentally. That.
Well, I believe C4. I think he is trying to help kids, but that's my personal belief. But everything I know about him and what he's trying to do seems very legitimate to me. In the game, may have some extra stuff, but neither here nor there. But I did think that was interesting. And so I wanted to also ask and finish with this. When you started TMC, it was kind of meant to give you a place to talk to the masses and in a way to defend yourself. So what has changed, if anything, from that point? Like, why is it different now? Why should it be taken differently if it should?
Are you talking about Imperium News or are you talking about defense? Because TMC was not created as a platform for defense. We realized that games journalists have incredibly thin skins and that they're not used to anybody having a voice to go after them. So in the way of...
so offense.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Attack, attack, attack. We have learned many things from watching elections collectively in DC. We have a lot of lawyers in Goonswarm. And it's great. I mean, you saw this most recently after the Meta Show last week, last Saturday, when Naiden, the editor-in-chief of Crossing Zebras, could not handle even the lightest condemnation from the bully pulpit. In many cases, writers, and you and I are both writers, so this is not me casting aspersions on writers from a position of ignorance, are not used to having a counterattack when they blog something. They're not used to actually taking incoming fire. And that is one of the things that we've used TMC for ever since Brendan Drain and Riverini did their little dance in 2012. Is when these guys get it wrong, we can hold them to account in a permanent record that will last forever on the internet, that they will not be able to escape, such that now there are consequences to trying to go after us. From a major media perspective, this doesn't work for, obviously a little irrelevant tweets don't matter and don't deserve a response, but the flak cannons exist for offensive reasons. We've read Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, like Personalize It, Radicalize It. These playbooks are just lying around in books for people to read and use, but they don't use them in EVE much.
So the Imperium News, as it's changing into TMC, is evolving into Imperium News with a new, basically technology behind it, but also a new, I don't know, I guess let's just say with technology behind it. Does it have a new mission, or is this kind of the same thing? It's a platform to fight back with through the media, basically.
I think it's a new mission all the way around. I wanted to get rid of the personality. I wanted to get rid of the Mittani aspect of it, and I wanted to have a platform, and conveniently our dev team, which you've been a part of, credit where it's due. The dev team has enabled with this new platform a lot of tools that can actually allow members of our community to basically do all the same things that we do on the staff. So one of the things I'm very excited about is the fact that our community can write articles of interest to them without being formally a staff writer. Still has to go through the editorial submissions process, but this in many ways takes those very same flak cannons that currently only a few people can control to defend ours against, and it's also defense for the entire EVE community, because when somebody from the games journalist side of the aisle writes something that's crap about EVE and is just wrong, we can aim the cannons in their direction too. But one of the things I'm excited about with Imperium News is that it allows not just members of the Imperium, but members of the EVE community as a whole to participate in a dialogue. So instead of being a staff writer and only reading what staff writers of EVE News 24 or Crossing Zebras or TMC write, everybody can participate using this new platform, friendly, hostile, neutral. And I think it's just going to be really exciting to see what people use those tools for, assuming that we can make them as user-friendly and as fun as possible.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. It's up ahead.
Indeed.
Well, thanks very much, Mittani, for sticking around.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks for listening. We'll see you at our regular time. That is Saturday, 1 p.m. UTC time zone, 9 a.m. Eastern time zone, 6 a.m. Pacific time zone. That's it for us today. We'll see you next time on Talking in Stations.